Okay, so good afternoon and good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world today. Thank you so much for joining us tonight or today. We're here to discuss the future of UK international development. This is the last speaker discussion of the ODC 2021 Symposium. Thank you everyone for joining us, especially to many of the students who I know are currently in the depths of many summer assessments. So thank you for taking your time to join us today. Before we begin, I'll just do some housekeeping, and I'm really happy to present that Agora Oxford, the Open Forum on Foreign Policy, is hosting a talk with the head of the Department of Politics and director of the Centre for Britain and Europe on post-Brexit development policy on Tuesday. The details of that are shared on our social media. Additionally, next Thursday, we've got our Develop Your networking event, where we've got a range of development professionals from those in NGOs, development financing, academia, and international organizations will be joining us. Again, all of those details are on our social media platforms and we'll be sharing over the next few days. And finally, a reminder that we do have our partnership with the United Nations Human Rights Council on an essay competition with the opportunity for someone's writing to be presented on the UNHCR's website and social media, and for it to be featured in The Independent. So, now that that is out of the way, we're here to discuss the future of UK international development. It's a very broad topic and we don't have too much time, but this comes in light of a number of seismic events in the world of UK international development. Of course, the UK left the European Union. The Department of International Development has been merged with the Foreign Office, and we've had a recent budget released that has been making some waves. And obviously, we continue in the midst of a global pandemic. Joining us to explore this topic, we've got a really wonderful panel. Firstly, we've got Andrew Mitchell. He was the Minister of International Development for over 2 years, as well as working in opposition. While serving as a Member of Parliament, he's worked on the National Security Council in Britain and then Governor of the World Bank. He's had numerous roles in investment banks and previously served as a UN peacekeeper. He's currently a fellow at Cambridge University and a visiting fellow at Harvard University and an honorary professor in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Birmingham. We have with us Preet Gill, who is serving as the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development and has shadowed the ministers of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office since the merging of the Department of International Development and the Foreign Office. Her work has operated with a geographical focus on Africa and Asia and on the topics of humanitarian policy and strategy, as well as gender equality, refugees, migration, and the UK's future international development partnerships with the EU, which is of course very timely. And additionally, she has experience working in communities in both Israel and India. And finally, we've got Haroun Atallah. He is a chartered accountant, auditor, and aid worker with expertise in development finance. And for over 20 years, he worked within the NGO Islamic Relief, including a number of years as CEO. He's currently Director of Finance and Support Services at the International Law Organization, which aims to enable governments and empower people to reform law and strengthen institutions to promote peace, justice, sustainable development, and economic opportunities. So I'm really thrilled that we've got a range of speakers here who have a combined experience across academia, within state international development, and across NGOs and large international organizations. So we wanted to look kind of today more at the paradigm and the model of UK international development and what challenges and influences are affecting the UK international development model we have today. So to start, as previously mentioned, DFID has been folded into the Foreign Office as at the start of 2021, and it was announced that the UK aid budget was also to be reduced. This follows in the footsteps of other countries such as Canada and the Netherlands, who folded their separate department into more central government, and they've cited increased coordination within the state as a benefit of this change. However, a number of NGOs have raised alarm and concern, and much wider than just NGOs. Andrew has stated that it's a quite extraordinary self-inflicted wound that will do huge damage to Britain's influence in the world. If I could first turn to you, Andrew, would you mind expanding a bit on your thoughts on the merger and what you meant here?
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be back speaking to Oxford development, particularly for someone who was educated at Cambridge University. And the last time I was speaking at Oxford to this group was in fact in 2010, in the run-up to the then general election. So it's very good to be back. In 2010, when the Labour government was defeated and the coalition came into power, I had always tried to suggest that British development leadership around the world was not either Labour or Conservative, it was British. And it was part of our DNA that we went to the help of those who are wretched in the world and tried to assist. It's, I thought, a very British thing to do. At that time, Britain was becoming and has been a development superpower. America is a military superpower. Britain has been a development superpower. And of course, it is our generations that have the opportunity to move the dial on development, because for the first time ever, partly because of globalization, but partly because of modern technology, we know so much about the ingredients of grinding poverty in some parts of the world, what to do about them, how to make the world a more equal place, and how to do something about these extremes of difference in opportunity and wealth, which disfigure our world today. So international development is, I think, the cause of our generations, and Britain has been a development leader. And a cross-party view on development has made that even more important because, as I say, it can be seen to be a British initiative. Now, I'm in the unusual position because I'm probably even more outspoken against my own party and government on this issue than Preet is, who's a distinguished member of the Shadow Cabinet and a development spokesman for the opposition. So you'll have to sort of lay off a bit for that. And you're not getting, if Boris Johnson was here, he wouldn't be telling you the same as what I'm saying to you. But here are what I see as the facts. The decision to merge DFID with the Foreign Office is a disaster for development policy. Why? Because it isn't a merger at all. It is the dismantling of DFID. And Mrs. Thatcher, who some of you may recall, at least historically, when she was in power, she wasn't a great fan of international development, but she did have a department for development within the Foreign Office. It was called the ODA, and it had a minister in charge of it, and it was a development department. Then Tony Blair moved that to a Department of State as a freestanding entity, DFID, and I would argue that the coalition turned it into more of a Department of State and less of a sort of well-upholstered charity moored off the coast of Whitehall. So it hasn't been merged, it's been dismantled. And of course, all the development expertise has gone out of the door. And the great thing about DFID was not just that it was a bunch of extremely talented civil servants who brought it all together. It was that it was the engine of poverty alleviation, respected around the world, and it brought into it the policy development in Britain's great universities, which drove this agenda, and also the activities on the ground of many of the international charities, many British-led, which affected differences on the ground, and the think tanks like the ODA, like the particular subset of Birmingham University, like Sussex University, the IDC. It brought in those policy formulators who turned it into active policy on the ground. And all of that has been lost. And at a time too, when the world is in the grips of a most terrible pandemic, to be cutting aid when you're also leading the G7 and in charge of the Conference of Parties in Glasgow on climate change, when the world is coming together, to be cutting aid, as we have done, is a most extraordinary error of judgment and shot in the foot. It's very hard to lead on these initiatives that are vital at this time and amplified by the COVID crisis, if you are simultaneously dismantling the reasons why you have been so preeminent as a strong organ of soft power, respected around the world, and also failing to deliver on the promises you've made, not just at the United Nations, but also in the manifesto commitments that every single member of parliament made when they were elected just over a year ago. So those would really be my rather depressing opening remarks. What I would say about the future is that there are several ways in which our generations can change the world. Educating girls. Educating girls, in my view, is the most effective way of changing the world. Why? Because if you educate girls, they will get married later, they will have less children, they will make sure that their own children are educated, they will take a leadership position in their local community, and as we've seen, for example, in Afghanistan, increasingly in regional and national government. And so I would make that a top priority, and so did Boris Johnson. And so in the Queen's speech, the Queen said it was a priority of the government. But it's very hard to do that if simultaneously you are cutting by 40% the amount of money that is being spent by Britain on education in the poorest parts of the world. Similarly, family planning, a great British objective to try and make sure that women can choose whether and when they have children. To slash the family planning budget by 85% is a terrible mistake. And of course, it ricochets against the education changes we want to see, because if girls are unable to get hold of contraceptive and family planning when they are in their teens and in school in some parts of the developing world, they will not stay in school. And so these two things are not unrelated, and yet Britain has seen these tremendously savage cuts, quite apart from the savage cuts in a place like Yemen, humanitarian aid, which Britain has cut by 60%, when we know perfectly well there is a famine in Yemen, from which small children are dying in agony. So this is a gloomy time for development. I hope very much we will be able to get it back on track, but it is a gloomy time. We have shot ourselves in the foot on a whole number of these issues. One has a terrible feeling that people who are making these decisions don't understand the effect of these decisions on an area of British government policy for which Britain has in the past done an enormous amount, shown real world leadership, and of which all of us can be extremely proud that our country has moved the dial in the past with such good effect.
Thank you. And if I could turn to you now, Preet, as we mentioned in your introduction, you have worked a lot specifically on gender equality and are in the official opposition. Do you have any differences with Andrew? What is the official opposition's position? And what are your views? I'm sure many of your audience will as well, some strong opposition coming from the opposition on this matter. So yes, please expand a bit on that if you could.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. And I just want to firstly start off by sort of thanking you as the Oxford Development Consultancy for really organising the panel today. And it's been really heartening since the takeover that actually what we have seen in the tabloids is actually a story about development and the impact of the cuts. And I think that has been really, really heartening, because there are so many people that want to make this a divisive issue. But actually, I don't think it's something we've got to recognise that actually what global Britain means, and actually the British people are absolutely standing in solidarity with suffering that takes place not just here but actually across the world. And so one of the first things I really want to start off with, I think, you know, it's actually seeing and understanding what the impact of aid and development can and does do. And I think I was really lucky in 2018, when I was the shadow minister in the development team, I went to visit Uganda, and I saw firsthand the extraordinary impact actually that aid can actually have on people's lives. Because I think it's so difficult sometimes when we're listening to the sector, we're watching the news, and we really don't understand the impact, because of course there'll be many stories being told about aid not being spent correctly, or it's going to governments. And of course we do not give governments aid, and it is through NGO sector, and it is about really building those relationships with host communities where you want to work. And something that sort of really stayed with me when I was in Uganda is I met a young boy. He saw his father being killed, his mother was missing, and he had to make that arduous journey on foot with his siblings from South Sudan to Uganda. And I remember coming there and thinking, I don't know how many people he's had to probably retell his story to, but he didn't need to tell me his story, because actually on his face, I could really see the anguish and the suffering. And immediately this 12-year-old boy has become the head of his household, and his youngest sibling was about 3 years of age. And I tell you, it's something that will stay with me, because I saw actually the work that the NGO sector was doing in terms of being able to build a home for him, providing food, livelihood, stock, stability, really giving dignity to people who have been displaced because of conflict, of course, in South Sudan, and then traveling across to Uganda. And actually, you have to commend countries like Uganda, who've taken in over 1.1 million South Sudanese refugees, and really trying to, create, not just, I don't want to go to places where you see refugee clusters altogether, but actually what was really heartening in Uganda was some real thinking through and working together with the UN institutions and other sectors about how you do development in a dignified way, just respecting, the very people that you kind of want to reach. But of course, the other thing that was really heartening was I went to see a child-friendly Ugandan refugee camp, and here they were providing 1,500 children with psychosocial, emotional welfare and well-being support. And most importantly, what I would say is the chance for a better future, because of course we forget that kind of mental anguish that affects so many people fleeing conflict situations. And just as we want the best for our children here in the United Kingdom, we've got to want the best for children around the world that we are, speaking up for, especially those living in conflict. And of course, a lot of these projects aren't actually possible without assistance and aid from the United Kingdom. And it shows really that when development is done properly, it can reach communities that otherwise would be left behind. And so this is just one example of what the aid budget can do, and why the government's actions over the last year have not only morally been reprehensible, but absolutely counterproductive, as Andrew commented on. And almost a year ago, they conducted institutional vandalism by scrapping the Department for International Development and subsuming it into the Foreign Office, as you have said. And since then, they've slashed the budget in a very haphazard way, I would say in a very callous way. There's been no clear strategy, no impact assessments being taken. Actually, the government have admitted that they didn't take out impact assessments, so they don't know that what they have cut, what kind of impact is it going to make. And only today we found out that it took them only 7 hours to make the cuts that they undertook last year. And that just pretty much tells you really what we are seeing from this government. Very arrogant, avoiding transparency, retreating from the world stage. But how do you make these callous cuts in the middle of a global pandemic? I mean, I think, there's been so much criticism levied at them globally because it's tarnishing our global reputation. And as Andrew said, our hard-won reputation as a country was something to be admired for. Our development work has been swatted aside in just a matter of months. We were world leaders in science and innovation, and all of this is actually being tarnished by this government. And it's been done because actually the government thinks that nobody cares. But as my fellow colleague Andrew Mitchell has shown, that this isn't about party political issues, but one where the government actually stands alone against the will of members of parliament from across the political spectrum. And that's, that's something we should take heart in terms of how our development communities can come together. And it isn't just really in parliament where these cuts are being, opposed. Britain and British people have had a proud history and tradition, a real sense of solidarity and community spirit to helping those in need or are suffering. And we've seen it when there's been humanitarian disasters around the world. It is the British public that always come forward with their generosity to really want to support other people. And we did it as a country. I mean, we only have to remember when we welcomed Jewish refugees that were fleeing from the Nazis, or whether it was supporting Yemeni people in the midst of the worst catastrophic humanitarian crisis. And as Andrew said, I mean, it's had, what, 60% of its budget cut, when we know people are absolutely facing famine, and so there will be a cost to lives. I mean, this is, if you can't even support the world's humanitarian crisis, what does it say about your priorities? What does it say about your commitments on the world stage, really? You know, this tradition that we've had here in Britain has been clear, especially in the last year. We've seen it from communities up and down the UK, whether they've set up groups to help neighbourhoods, whether they're neighbours donating to food banks, or providing company for those who are lonely. And this is a history, this is a reputation which Britons can absolutely be proud of. And one of the things we've been doing is really pushing back on that narrative that seeks to make this a very divisive point. And it's that vision, really, that Labour wants to build on. The pandemic has just shown us that we can't isolate ourselves from what happens in other countries. We've got to have a positive vision based on partnerships and on working together, working with people in the UK and around the world to tackle the global challenges facing us, whether that's future pandemics, because of course we've got to be prepared for future issues, but of course growing inequality. How many millions more people will be pushed into poverty? And of course then there is the climate emergency and the crisis that is going to cause displacement of people, but it's impacting those people that have had least responsibility for it. And that's why really one of the first acts of being appointed as Shadow Secretary of State was to call for evidence looking at the primary and secondary impacts of COVID-19, especially across the global south. And it was really heartening to see so many submissions coming in. And you know, we've met with ministers from other countries, we've met with WHO representatives, and I met with the director of the African Centres for Disease Control and Prevention, because we know vaccine apartheid is a real issue. You know, the capacity in Africa just does not exist to be able to mass manufacture and distribute the vaccine. And this is a situation that no country should ever find itself in as we go forward, because there will be, as I said, future pandemics. And furthermore, we've set up an international climate justice network to understand really what's happening on the ground to those communities at the sharp end of the climate crisis, because we know it's going to disproportionately affect women and girls. And we've also launched, you know, a consultation on how we can achieve gender equality across our development priorities. And that's why I'm here today to discuss how we work together to build a development policy fit for the future challenges facing the globe, and how we can deliver a much better, a fairer and safer world for us all. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to work with there. And yes, very excited to discuss moving towards the future. We've started to have a few questions come in on some of the future challenges of international development. And I do encourage everyone watching to keep submitting them. But just before we go there, I'd really love now to turn towards Haroun. And I would love for you to be able to speak a little bit more with your very extensive experience working within the NGO sector, to talk on how the merger and then the budget cuts are likely to be received by many of the British NGOs. If you wouldn't mind speaking on that.
Thank you for inviting me, Myri, and thank you for my fellow panelists. Very nice to be with such a distinguished panel talking about this important subject. I started my career, as you mentioned, as a chartered accountant in Dublin, and I moved to the humanitarian work in '93. And one of the first projects I was auditing was a project funded by the ODA that back then, as Andrew mentioned. And over the years, of course, there was more work with DFID then, while I worked with Islamic Relief at the time. And I realized something from my 20 years working as a humanitarian worker is that while you enter into this work because you want to resolve hunger and to help people in need, you realize that we're living in an interconnected world, and there are many elements that impact people's lives and lead to the situation of inequality that we suffer from in the world today. For us all working as humanitarian workers, we've probably had discussions with family members and friends who would just turn around to you and repeat a narrative, which we've heard often on some media outlets, that when we're going through tough times, we need to turn around and look after our own people and before we start spending money to help others around the world. That's a very logical, very simple argument that I've heard many times. I've had this discussion with a close family member just a few days ago, long conversation over the phone. The United Kingdom made two commitments. One of them was made in the 70s, and that was about giving 0.7% of the GMP national produce towards development, towards humanitarian aid. And that took a very long time to achieve. And the second one we made more recently in 2015, and that was the Sustainable Development Goals. As our listeners would know, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals cover 17 goals. And if you look at them, 1 and 2 are about hunger and poverty. While, of course, if you look down, you will realize there are things like the environment, if you're looking at social justice. And that's what I realized as a humanitarian worker. Often we go into situations, we want to provide people with food, but you realize that if there is no safety, if there is no protection for people, then you have a problem. And often as well, you realize that the roots of a problem are not so much about, say, a natural disaster, but a situation where political environment causes humanitarian problems. For this reason, I don't believe that we could separate the Sustainable Development Goals one from the other. The impact on the environment has an impact on people's livelihoods in parts of the world. And when you look at SDG 16, which I am very concerned with in my work at the moment, if you don't have an atmosphere of justice and peace and an environment where corruption is curtailed, then you will find as well that the efforts that we do to develop the world together and to address the challenges that face humanity together in a united way would be liquidated. One of the concerns I have about the merger is that these Sustainable Development Goals need clear leadership. They need a connected leadership to be able to look at issues, whether we're looking at gender equality, whether we are looking at responsible consumption and production, or even if you're just looking at industry, innovation, and communities. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you can't separate them. My concern is that you can't separate them in different departments when we are trying to work in a joined up manner with other governments around the world to try and achieve this impact by 2030. This is a concern I have. Of course, as I said, I worked with in the ODA days, and then I saw, of course, a great improvement over the years working with DFID. My move then was to Transparency International, and I stayed in Berlin for 4 years looking at anti-corruption, and I worked very closely with DFID, and DFID had a fantastic program of work at that period of time and a very talented team on working with other governments around the world. I learned, of course, we can all be very righteous and think there should be no corruption. And often corruption, I don't like the description of corruption as it being part of the culture in a country. I don't believe so, having worked to counter it for a long period of time. I think that there are conditions and circumstances that have allowed it to grow in different parts of the world. And unless we work in a joined up manner, we have realized, for example, trying to work with the extractables industry, that they may feel they are losing a competitive advantage if regulations are self-imposed, if you like, by one company and not the rest of the sector. And the same can be said for any other industry for that matter. This is why governments need to work together to create the regulations and the environment that create the even playing field that allows a country that is well regulated and working within the law, as the United Kingdom is, for it to flourish, for us to do business with other parts of the world. So I would take the view that the work that the United Kingdom does is not just simply about helping others in need around the world. We have a vested interest in making sure that we work with others. I mean, I would say then, moving on to the point of the cuts themselves and the amount of money, the decision wasn't just simply about cutting the money. It was also not keeping the commitment of the 0.7% of the GMP. Now, if you cut 5 billion, as they have, from 15 to 10 billion, or something around these numbers, if you look at it in terms of government spending, it's not even 2 days spending. So the saving is not a huge amount of saving. And one wonders then, what is the real, even if they wanted to stick to the 0.7% on the basis that the GMP came down last year, it may have had a more logical element to it. Now, I would also go further and say this: when we look at the manner in which cuts are being done and how the decisions have come out to the sector, you're speaking about NGOs. I'm sure all our listeners know that all the NGO sector have complained extensively, because this has come in a year when we have an unprecedented crisis that is facing humanity, and a pandemic that has devastated economies, and of course, before that, people's lives around the world. And unless we work in a joined up manner, then the results would be catastrophic, as we have seen with the vaccine situation. I think the pandemic has exposed that a country can't think or believe that it is immune from what's happening in other parts of the world. Even if we believe we have vaccinated our population at the moment and we seem to have things under control, we cannot forget that just a few months ago in January, 1,700 people a day were dying in the United Kingdom. And a year before that, when it started in China, nobody imagined in the United Kingdom that it would reach this level. So I think we are living in a very connected world. We need to work with others around the world to face the challenges that are before us. And we need to realize that having a government department that is responsible for delivering on this on a global basis is a bit different from the diplomacy required from the Department of Foreign Affairs. It has a very important mission. It has a very important diplomatic role to play on a global basis, but it's a slightly different role, not a slightly, I would say it's quite a different role from the role of leadership on delivering something like the Sustainable Development Goals. So from that point of view, I would imagine that, of course, the disappointment in the sector, all sections of it, and not just the humanitarian work, has been palpable. And we're waiting to see how not just the United Kingdom government, but other governments that have chosen this path, how they will be able to manage the delivery of these goals in the manner that they have set themselves up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And now we've got two audience questions have come in, which are kind of interrelated on the reputation of the UK. So the first one has come in on if you think, for all speakers, if you think the merging of DFID and the FO has damaged the UK's reputation. From what they understand, DFID was quite renowned. And we've got a second question asking the speakers to share that the merger amounts to the dismantling of DFID and is a political disaster. How will or should the UK restore its international reputation as a global leader in international development? Andrew, would you like to begin?
Well, there are two key aspects to Britain's leadership. The first is the rules which govern the way development money is spent. And the second is the money. And of the two, the rules are more important. And the dismantling of DFID, which I've already made clear why I think it's an absolute disaster, because it wasn't just that it was a bunch of civil servants, it was that there was that engine of poverty alleviation, which drew in all the academic stuff from the great universities and the feet on the ground and the efforts and understanding on the ground of British charities, British-led charities, and the think tank work. So that's what's been dismantled. In return for a foreign office, it doesn't really understand development. Many in the foreign office think that development is the ambassador's spouse's favorite charity. It isn't. It's long tail stuff to achieve the sort of things I mentioned when I was talking about girls' education. You can't disrupt the program on girls' education 1 year and put it back, because it's like if you take year 7 out of school, people miss out on year 7 and they can't proceed to the other year. So it's long tail stuff. And you know, it used to be said around Whitehall that the Foreign Office does prose and DFID does money. And I believe I'm right in saying that when Tony Blair went to an international conference where money was involved, he always took a senior DFID official with him. Why? Because DFID understand money. And the idea of these Foreign Office people running multi-million-pound programs overseas should give the taxpayer the heebie-jeebies, because money won't be well spent. The Foreign Office doesn't do money. That's not what they're absolutely brilliant, our British diplomats around the world, but they don't do money and they don't understand about development. And so with the expertise of DFID walking out the door, because it isn't a merger, it's a dismantling, we are losing those skills. Now then you cut the money as well. The only thing that remains is to cut the rules and to say that the rules aren't quite right for Britain and we want to scrap the rules which are set by the OECD Development Assistance Committee in Paris, which was set up after the war by the Americans. And you know, even Donald Trump didn't try to tamper with the rules. But I have a nasty feeling nagging at the back of my mind, keeps me awake at night, that we're suddenly going to hear soon, oh, well, the rules aren't quite right for Britain, we need to tweak them, so we're going to have our own rules. And once you do that, the game is completely over, because the money will be spent by the stronger departments in Whitehall, and you will find the money is being spent on battleships and bullets and not on babies and development. So, you know, in a way, beware of the third aspect being destroyed. We've got to try and persuade the government to put back the money and to stand by this 0.7 promise. I mean, it is a bit of an irony. I made this point in the media yesterday. It's a bit of an irony that Brexit, which is supposed to put power back into Parliament, not into executive government fiat, but into the legislature. And the government's frightened of having a vote on this because they fear they might lose, because there's enough of my Conservative colleagues who won't go along with it. So we're slightly in the position of sort of standing outside a mouse hole with a lump of cheese, trying to coax the government to have the courage to have a vote so that they can take the mind of Parliament and see what members of Parliament representing their constituents think is the right thing to do on this 0.7 promise. And you know, if we don't have that vote, then we are dependent on the government bringing back the promise. But the promise, you know, they say they'll bring it back when fiscal circumstances allow, but that's about the weakest possible indication you can conceivably imagine of a date, of a timeline, or a date, specific date promise.
Thank you for that, Preet. I could see you agreeing with some of what Andrew is saying, and as a member of Parliament as well, would you like to make some remarks on how the UK might be able to restore its international reputation?
Yeah, but just firstly, coming on the first question, which was, you know, have we damaged our relationship? Of course we've damaged our relationship, because I mean, you know, as Andrew, as many others have said, we're a world-renowned leader in terms of development, you know, and considered to be a superpower. And of course, we've tarnished our reputation because we've seen to be nasal gazing. I mean, who in their right mind would take over a department, would make cuts to the world's poorest in the middle of a global pandemic, knowing full well that many of these countries were already struggling because, of course, health system strengthening is a big issue. Look what's happening in India. India only spends 2% of its GDP on health. So we know global health systems were always going to struggle. But in many of these countries, of course, they were grappling with other, you know, issues of primary and secondary impacts of COVID-19. So yes, it's damaging our relationship. And what's really interesting, it's damaging our relationship in the year that we are chairing the G7, the Global Partnership for Education, and COP26. So when we should be galvanizing support out there, you know, as I would, as Andrew would, in a global pandemic, bringing countries together, finding solutions to some of the global problems and tackling them, especially when we know that the Serum Institute isn't going to be exporting vaccines, especially to the COVAX facility. It requires the G7 to show some very clear leadership. Now, no one is going to be going to Rob or having any confidence in Rob, when actually what he has done, he's retreated from the world stage. He's taken over a department that he clearly does not understand. He has no knowledge of. How on earth do you spend 7 hours and make cuts and you don't even use impact assessments? I mean, it is just beyond shocking. So yes, our reputation is absolutely being damaged. We're the only G7 nation to cut aid, the only G7 nation to cut aid. I mean, what message are we signaling? What does global Britain actually mean? Global Britain is about being a force for good around the world, right? You know, this very fact that he's signaling to other richer nations that actually they can go ahead and cut aid. I mean, developing countries are watching this. It hasn't gone amiss on them about our actions. And actually, what France has said is, you know what, we're going to increase our commitment to aid to 0.7 by 2025. And so I think it's just utterly shaming. And the thing is, for me, in order for COP26 to be a success, you need the 130 developing countries on side to give it credibility, because they can block agreements. And to sort of signal a retreat from the world stage, to tell them actually that they don't matter and they're seriously not a priority, is absolutely tarnishing Britain's reputation around the world. And, you know, I've heard this from so many other people, and it's really, really disheartening, because, you know, the government, as I said, would like to make this a divisive issue, would like to tell us that some parts of the British public actually don't care about these issues. And actually, that's the bit we've got to come together and really push back, because, you know, whilst many people are just focused on what's happening here nationally, and domestic priorities, of course, on a global level, when we're talking about cooperation, whether it's going to be on vaccine production, let's not forget, you know, other countries have been supporting the effort in terms of being able to produce. The deal that AstraZeneca and Serum Institute did was about supporting the rest of the world, not just the COVAX facility. We had bilateral deals that have been done with different countries. And of course, you know, we've got to recognize that. We've got to recognize that we haven't been able to do this on our own, and therefore no other country can also do this on their own. The future relationship, I mean, look, what's really clear about this government is there's a lack of understanding about development, you know, and how they're going to manage budgets, how Rob thinks that he can be on top of foreign policy issues and development is beyond me, because certainly in the year that we've seen him take over the department, he hasn't been on top of any of the development issues as far as we have seen. And what's clear, though, is that the government loves headlines. They love to make commitments, and, you know, they're chairing the Global Partnership for Education. They have a new envoy for education, and, you know, they're going around saying, we're making commitments to girls' education. We think this is really important. It was a manifesto commitment for the Conservatives as well. But of course, when you look at the detail, you've just cut girls' education by 40%. So either you're misleading us, either you're just not being honest, and you're avoiding any kind of transparency for us to hold you account. Because what's coming out from government is absolutely the reverse, just like the 0.7 commitment was a manifesto commitment. And they've reneged on it. And so, you know, it is about really holding the government to account. I mean, this navel gazing, you know, the Institute for Government said, when you take over a department, it costs about £50 million. We don't have £50 million of taxpayers' money to be wasting, restructuring a department which was world renowned. There's been so much low morale within the civil service in development. You know, we are losing really good staff that we've had, that we should be really proud of, that we should be trying to keep hold of, because, you know, there just is this kind of sidelining of civil servants. And the thing that's really worrying me is there are very little decisions being taken from a development perspective, because, of course, many ministers don't know what they're doing in terms of the global. There's no strategy, by the way. The government doesn't know what its priorities are. We have no information as to what country offices' budgets are going to look like, what conversations have been had with ambassadors. And so, you know, it's so important that we hold this government to account, that we work together, we make sure that we continue to keep talking about development and why it's important. And it isn't just about the NGO sector, because I think we need to shift away from that view that it's only the NGO sector that must have this relationship with government or hold it to account. All of us matter, all our voices matter, because, you know, it isn't just about, as we've talked about it before, it isn't about party political issue, it's cross-party, it's faith organizations, it's the diaspora community. There is so much support for development in this country, but we need to get people to understand and get behind it, and understand, especially with the pandemic, what it has really enabled people to think about is the suffering that they've gone through. They're able to relate to the suffering elsewhere in the world. And I think we need to really make sure that we focus on that solidarity piece, and that we were bringing people together to have a conversation about what the future relationship is going to be like. I can say that certainly retaining my role and my team, Keir has given a very clear message that actually he cares about development. It's really important to him, and it's something that he's committed to, and he's not prepared to mirror what the government has done, and he's not prepared to lose that voice, and he's certainly not going to turn his back on the world's poorest. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Time has absolutely flown and we've only got about 10 or 15 minutes left, so I'm going to try and scoot through quite a few.
Can I come in
questions
on
that we've got.
this issue, Mary?
Oh, yes, of course. I was hoping to send another question directly to you after this, but
I mean, I think I will talk from the perspective of somebody who has worked as a humanitarian worker in many conflict zones around the world. One of the issues that I think we need to realize merging DFID with the Department of Foreign Affairs has an impact on the ground is that when you are working in conflict zones, it takes a lot of effort to build confidence with people for them to realize that your intentions from doing aid, whether it's teaching girls or whether it's building schools or whatever else you're doing, is not connected with some other political dimension. There was always a very respectful relationship of separation between the DFID department, which is housed within the embassies of the United Kingdom and around the world, and the Department for International Development's staff who are working in the country. And I've experienced that in different parts of the world where I visited British embassies and met with DFID and met with diplomats as well and ambassadors, and they're very respectful, but a relationship where each understood that they had a sphere of work area they had to work in. And I could see how over time they would build confidence with the civil servants and officials and the public as they gradually come in after, say, a conflict or where there might be negative perceptions of British involvement. I can't see how the merger can help reduce such perceptions. The second thing, I want to echo something Andrew said, and that's the professionalism of people in DFID, which I mean, experienced. I'm a person with a financial background. I was in a country that had experienced a natural disaster. We were part of an international campaign, or a national campaign, if you'd like to call it, to have this country's foreign debt written off. And I remember a very good discussion with the DFID people in that country, and they pointed out that they would be willing to recommend this to government if they had seen that the government in question was actually collecting enough taxes as a percentage of income, especially from the rich. Now we're talking about not the direct tax, which is crude and comes in, hits rich and poor, but we're talking about the income tax, which targets, of course, the wealthier people in society. And he pointed out that in that country, it was less than 9% of the GDP, while, you know, the lowest European country at the time was Greece, 19%. They've improved a little bit since then, but you'd expect it to be in the range of 20-25%. He said even if they were to meet the standards of Greece, we would be willing to recommend this. Now, I would see this as a nuanced approach to how soft power is played with information and knowledge. And I think none of us in the humanitarian world who were campaigning for the write-off of the debts accepted that in that country, the amount of taxes collected is being spent on a police force to protect the rich and powerful in the country and leaving the rest of the population. So I think when we look at both these elements, these examples I gave, you will find that I can't see how the merger would enhance. Final point I would make is this, that we have to realize with Britain being out of the European Union, that it also has vacated a very important seat to influence for what was mentioned, the soft power. Now, if we are also pulling back from the intergovernmental bodies, the international organizations that are, if you like, influencing policy in different parts of the world, then we are actually reducing our influence further. And that could have a direct impact on our interests around the world. We have to realize, of course, that if we are absent from different parts of the world, then our opportunity even for doing business and trade, or ensuring that the standards by which business is conducted in different parts of the world, or indeed even the impact of international rules of trade can have a very negative impact on us in Britain. So I can't see how it is beneficial for Britain, of course, if it is a very short-term measure, as has been said by government. We wait and see. I think finally then I would say this, that it is not just the government in Britain that has taken these steps. And we have to realize that other governments around the world have taken similar steps over the last few years. And unfortunately, I think the COVID crisis has exposed a lurch back to a period when international global cooperation has been exposed to be a lot more fragile than we had thought it was. We thought we had matured more than this on the international stage, but everybody raising their own flag and saying me first it has unfortunately become more dominant now. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind if we stay with you just for 1 second, I would love to ask you, we've got 2 questions. I'd love to directly ask you one question, and then I've got another question that's going to be directed at Andrew and Preet just to finish us off. So Haroun, how do you see the global South-South development affecting the international aid policy arena going forward, particularly the work of the China Development Bank? Obviously, this has been a huge discussion point in recent years. How do you think that's affecting the international aid policy arena?
I must admit, Mari, I'm not an expert on the issue that is being questioned, but I can say that I have had a lot of interaction with the issue of course, China and its engagement on the international scene more actively. What we can see, of course, that the Chinese government for the last few years has been engaging with international organizations in a more systematic manner than it had been in previous years. We know, of course, that China has huge business interests around the world, and we know the huge project they're doing, the One Belt project, and its impact on many countries, and of course, its potential impact on trade routes around the world. I think there is, of course, the rising political tensions between the great powers of the world and the rising influence of China. And one would hope that the trade deals that seem to have been set aside by very quick political decisions in the last few years can be somehow restored, or the discussions restored in a civil manner that allows the interests of all people to be around the world to be advanced. I think one of the negative things that we have seen is that once, if we leave every country to try and do deals with on a bilateral basis with smaller countries, let's say around the world, it leads to a skewed relationship, and it is not beneficial for these countries in the longer term. This is why I think a global approach to development and more mature cooperation is required. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I could now just turn to Preet, we've got a question coming in from Jen saying, some argue that DFID should have seen the merger and cuts coming because they had been acting unilaterally and were becoming critical of the government's stance when they should have been more politically neutral. What are the speaker's thoughts on this?
I don't think anyone really anticipated the kind of cuts that we were expecting. Of course, we knew with the pandemic that there would be a fall in GNI, and naturally there'd be a fall in the budget. And of course, one of the things that we were very quickly talking about was how we could possibly repurpose ODA spent by other government departments, so that what we weren't seeing was going to be the kind of impact on programs. I mean, what's been really, really disheartening about these kind of cuts and why they're deemed to be so callous is because, of course, many of them were just about to start, or many of them had started and have suddenly just been cut. And so people have just been left in the lurch with nothing else to replace it. And so it hasn't been something that we could have I think, look, many of us thought there was going to be some decisions made about DFID, because I think, Boris, the Prime Minister, has given an indication of what he had thought for many, many years. And certainly, you know, what nobody had anticipated was after the general election, especially given that these were manifesto commitments about commitment for 0.7, but also girls' education and on development, that these were going to be reneged in such a way. I don't think anyone could have anticipated that this government was going down this route in the middle of a pandemic, especially because, of course, the taking over Whitehall restructures is never an easy task to do. It's never, you know, how do you restructure a department that you don't even know what your strategy and your priorities are? I mean, the government's working the other way around. I mean, you know, it's very clear that the development voices are very limited in terms of the new structure. So yes, we kind of anticipated that there would be some political choices. We knew that the merger will take place. We did not anticipate that the way that the cuts were announced, drip feeding us, because of course this government was avoiding scrutiny. It knows it will lose a vote if it brings it back to the House. So, you know, the other thing I would say is, having met with the NGO sector, I think it's been really, really difficult in the last 5 to 6 years, given the nature of the relationship and the relationship around, government providing grants and programming and support, etc. There's been this over-reliant relationship, and I think that's never healthy. You know, NGOs have got to be able to criticize and be a critical friend, and you know, and it's got to work both ways. You can't just have it where they're tiptoeing and they're worried and they can't raise issues and concerns. Actually, that's not healthy at all. And so what I would say is that, given where we are right now, it's so important that we all work together. You know, I think the backlash against the sort of direction of travel by the government has pretty spooked them. I think it's been a pretty much of a shock, because, like I said, they didn't think that people cared about development, and clearly they've been proven much wronger. So rather than shouting from the rooftops about all the different projects that have been cut and programs that they are, you know, what they've tried to do is just sneak these things out in the hope that no one's going to pay too much attention, no one's actually going to notice, because there's far too many other priorities that we're facing domestically. And actually, like I said, we've actually seen a story after story, week after week in the last year, about the level of cuts that were coming our way. Thanks.
And specifically on that point about if DFID should have been more politically neutral, do you think that would have made a difference?
You're asking me that question, or?
Oh, anyone can come in if they'd like to.
I see we're over time, so and I've got to go in a moment. But let me try to have a go. I mean, there's no question of DFID being politically motivated. DFID is a collection of civil servants who serve the government of the day. And interestingly, when I came into office in 2010, I did talk to the permanent secretary about the fact that there were people there who had only ever worked for a Labour government. And I hope that they would be able to adapt to having a Conservative Secretary of State. And I think the Permanent Secretary is very surprised I even asked the question. Of course, they immediately served the government of the day and did it brilliantly and diligently. So there's no question of any idea that DFID was somehow plying its own furrow. It was always part of the constellation of Whitehall, and the way you wire together defence, diplomacy, and development, the 3 key international activities of the government, is through the National Security Council, which pulls them all together with the agencies, and worked extremely well under David Cameron. Look, the reason why DFID has been abolished, which was done in great secrecy, I didn't know about it at all, literally until an hour before the Prime Minister stood up to speak in the Commons. I was 100 miles away, so I was unable to take part. It was kept under very great wraps, so no one knew. The reason why the money for DFID has been cut, or the money for development has been cut, is because it's thought to be popular in the red wall seats. And, you know, there's polling which shows that 81% of people in the red wall seats want to see development aid money sent overseas cut. But actually, there's other polling which shows that 92% of people in the red wall seats believe you shouldn't cut humanitarian aid. And it's clearly not an economic issue. Why? Because it's 1% of the COVID expenditure. In the last year, we spent 400 billion, quite rightly, shoring up people's livelihoods on and prosecuting the campaign against COVID. 400 billion. This cut is 1% of that. So it's clearly not an economic issue. It's about, because the government think it goes down well in the red wall seats. Well, members of parliament are elected on a manifesto, we all promised we wouldn't do this, and members of parliament are elected to do what they think is right and in the interests of their constituents. And I'm in no doubt whatsoever that what is right and in the interests of the good people of the royal town of Sutton Coldfield who elected me, what is right and proper is to stand by a promise we made in the manifesto and restore this pernicious cut back to the full 0.7 as soon as we possibly can.
Great. And on that very strong remark, and as Andrew said, we have run over. So I'd like to thank our speakers for a wonderful conversation. I'm very sorry for all the questions that we weren't able to get to. I know we wish we had more time and we could ask a million questions to our speakers. But again, thank you so much for your attendance. Any audience members, we do have half an hour reserved for our breakout room, so if you'd like to stay and discuss these matters, please do, and we'll sort you into rooms. But for now, I'd like to thank our speakers once more. Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. It sounds like we have a rocky road ahead for international development, but I'm sure everyone is going to be keeping up with all of your actions moving forward. And again, thank you so much for your input. It's been a real pleasure and an honour.
Thank you. Pleasure all mine. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great. Thanks so much for having us.
Great.
All the best. All the best with your studies.
Oh,
Bye.
thank you. So we should now